I'm Thanasi Kambanis. This is the TCF World Podcast, episode 40. Today, we're going to talk about Israel-Palestine in our continuing series of conversations about progressive U.S. foreign policy and how and what a different, better foreign policy might look like. Today, we're joined here in New York by Dalia Shandlin, a political scientist from Tel Aviv, who is also an occasional contributor to the Century Foundation's work on Israel-Palestine, and my colleague Michael Wahid Hanna, a senior fellow at the Century Foundation. Thanks, everyone, for coming in today.
Thanks for having me.
Today, we're going to have a three-part conversation. We're going to start off by talking about long-term trends in the politics of Israel-Palestine. And then in the second part, we're going to talk about where the conflict stands today. And in the third part, we're going to move to possibilities for a different U.S. policy. So let's jump right in, Dalia. You've done a lot of, you've spent a whole career doing in-depth polling on political trends. Where is Israel-Palestine heading, and where is its center of political gravity today?
Maybe we should start by explaining why we are talking about Israel-Palestine as if it's one unit. I mean, the two entities are developing in a kind of trajectory that doesn't allow for them to be seen separately from one another. They're completely intertwined, practically interdependent in a way. Of course, it's not a symmetrical situation, but I don't think you can really discuss one without discussing the other at this point. So we can focus more on Israeli politics today because we are coming up to elections pretty soon, the second election that we are having this year. But Palestinian politics is no less important. The only difference is that they haven't had elections in many years. They have a divided government, and it seems like a very atrophied political situation, which essentially plays into Israel's advantage because it kind of lets Israel off the hook for negotiations. But we can talk about that a little bit later. On the Israeli side, we're having our second election in the same year because in the elections in April, Israel, the winners of the election, which was the Likud party, was not able to form a government. And therefore, the coalition negotiations fell apart, and they decided to go into a new round of elections. And the confusing thing is that the parties keep shifting; they keep changing, merging, emerging, collapsing. Many lists might merge, so we can't really know exactly where the elections are going. And for that reason, I think it's more valuable to look at the long-term trends of who Israelis are and what kinds of positions are on offering from the parties over the long term.
So have you found that there are consistent trends on the big issues of how people see themselves defining right, left, or center, how Palestinians and Israelis view the long-term trends of their preferences?
Yeah, there are some very consistent long-term trends. Once you get away from the actual question of which party you're going to vote for, the biggest long-term trend in Israeli society that hasn't changed a lot over the years, and there's an interesting parallel in Palestinian society, is for Israelis, the self-identification question of whether they consider themselves left, right, or centrist. And those are very meaningful concepts in Israeli life. It's the same as your liberal conservative axis in other countries, or, liberal conservative is probably the best parallel. On the Palestinian side, it does tend to be party identification, by the way. So whether you identify more with Fatah or Hamas, that carries the same kind of weight as it does in Israeli society in terms of the axis. And these self-identified labels are very strong indicators of a whole range of policy positions, but first and foremost, they indicate for Israelis where they stand on the issue of security and the conflict, which is essentially two sides of the same coin. Where people stand on security is simply a reflection, or the other side of the looking glass in terms of where they stand on the conflict. If they're really, really focused on security, they're probably right wing, and if they're really, really focused on peace, they're left wing, and if they're generally for a two-state solution, but they don't really see how we get there, but they would probably agree to it if they felt things could go in that direction, they're probably centrist. And that's been a very, very consistent finding over the years in Israel. And the breakdown very much reflects what we see in elections over the long term. So about half of Israeli society, of Israeli adults, identify themselves as right-wing. About a quarter identify themselves as centrists, and roughly 20%, 1/5, identify as left-wing.
Is this Jewish Israelis or
No,
Israelis
that's
overall?
all of Israeli society. If you look just at Jewish Israelis, who are about 80% of all Israelis, you see that the tilt is more towards the right wing. We have between 56 and even up to close to 60% who self-identify as right wing. So much heavier right wing orientation among Jews and a much smaller orientation towards left-wing. About 15% of Jews consider themselves to be left-wing, and a similar number of centrists as among the general population, between 25 and 30%, depending on margin of error, but it doesn't change that much when you just isolate the Jews. But you can see that there's a much heavier right-wing tilt, and that is very much reflected in not only how the right-wing parties present themselves, but also how the center parties, and sometimes even the parties that are considered left-wing, try to appeal to voters. They're all trying to present themselves and convince Israelis that they're not too far left-wing, because left is kind of a dirty word, considering that just a small percentage identify with that concept.
Are the Palestinians with Israeli citizenship also majority right-wing?
No, Palestinians who have Israeli citizenship are what tilt the balance back to the original numbers that I said. So if you have among Jews close to 60% who identify as right-wing, so few Palestinian citizens of Israel identify as right-wing that they bring down that average to 50%. The numbers are very small. They're not non-existent. I mean, there are Palestinian citizens of Israel, primarily Druze, but not only, right? Druze being a very small portion of the Palestinian society in Israel, who identify as right-wing, but they're not heavily ideological. They just have a historic kind of loyalty to Likud party going way back to the early years of the statehood. And so that number is small. It's usually about somewhere between 20 and 25%, but obviously much lower than the Jewish population. You have a higher portion who consider themselves left-wing, usually about 30, 35, even 40%, and about 20 or 25% who consider themselves centrist. The biggest difference among Palestinian citizens of Israel in surveys is that there's a much higher portion who don't want to give any identification and take themselves out in that sense. And I think it has to do with their suspicion of being sort of identified politically. They're suspicious of Israeli politics, and they feel increasingly like they might be somehow, they're already feeling in a very uncertain situation in Israel. It's gotten worse over the last decade. There's been legislation targeting them. There's been growing tensions. The nation-state law, of course, has left them extremely alienated and fearful for their position as citizens and really destroying their hope of ever gaining equality. And many, I think, are becoming disillusioned in general and sort of remove themselves from political life. And so that's why we see a higher portion who simply don't want to identify at all.
And to the extent the Arab parties are participating, it's a strange kind of participation. So maybe if you could just describe that.
It's a
briefly.
Strange participation because it's a bit tormented in terms of the dilemmas that they face. I mean, there's always a discussion in Palestinian society in terms of Israeli citizens, right? Arab Israeli, Palestinian Israeli citizens, about to what extent do you join the system, or to what extent do you try to be outside the system and really be a very tough opposition? The interesting thing is that traditionally over the years, the Palestinian citizens of Israel have opted for a much more integrationist approach to social life in general. Their desire is to be equal citizens, is to join the workforce, is to share in basically all aspects of Israeli life. And for most of their history, that means voting as well. The political parties, however, have reflected this dilemma in the following way. They always compete to be in the parliament, in Israel's Knesset. We often have 3 Arab parties competing, even though they're only about 20% of society. But they have a very strong sensitivity and generally skepticism towards the idea of joining the governing coalition. Now, there's another side of that, and that they've never been invited to join the governing coalition. No Jewish party has ever invited an independent Arab party in Israel to join the governing coalition.
Not even Labor?
Not even Labor. Labor has had satellite Arab parties, long ago during the time when much of the Arab population was controlled by a military government. So they weren't even truly independent parties, and they were satellites within Labor. So technically, on a very, very technical level that I think doesn't really count, there have been Arab parties inside the governing coalition, but not ever as independent parties. And not when Arabs were ever truly independent and equal citizens, because they were still under martial law in Israel until 1966. As independent parties, they've never been invited in, and therefore they've never held executive power. But again, that dilemma remains. And so I think one of the interesting changes that we're seeing among the Palestinian citizens of Israel is a growing debate about, if Israeli society, if the right-wing government over the last 10 years has been making their life harder and harder, targeting them, passing legislation against them, undercutting their de jure equality in Israeli society, one of the responses, one of the arguments is that they should respond by being even more integrated and even possibly joining the governing coalition if they were ever to be invited in. I have asked that question in a survey among Palestinian citizens of Israel and had over 80% who would support an Arab party joining the governing coalition. And I think that really reflects the sense that there is a crisis. You either remove yourself completely or you try to get as deeply, as close as you can to the centers of power. And it's a major dilemma right now among the Arab community.
We'll be right back.
What exactly would a progressive foreign policy look like in the Middle East? What can governments do differently and better? Critiques are easy. Providing realistic policy proposals is harder. I'm Michael Wahid Hanna, and with my colleagues and collaborators here at the Century Foundation, we're trying to answer the hard policy questions with specific, concrete proposals. You can see our ideas and join the conversation at our website, tcf.org.
I'm Thanasi Kambanis. You're listening to the TCF World Podcast. I'm here with Dalia Scheinlin from Tel Aviv, a political scientist and expert on politics in Israel-Palestine, and Michael Wahid Hanna, a senior fellow at the Century Foundation. We were just talking about the long-term trends in Israeli politics, and now I want to turn our attention to the state of play in the conflict, and also sort of where people stand on the two-state or one-state solution.
Where things stand on the conflict is, it's almost a murky question right now. It's hard to even know how to define it. Is it really a conflict, or is it simply a permanent situation of Israeli control, de facto control over all the territory between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea? And that control takes various forms. But I think that after, 52 years after 1967, it is not accurate to call it a temporary situation, which is one of the definitions of military occupation, is that it's supposed to be temporary. It's clearly no longer temporary. Israel formally controls civil and military affairs in most of the West Bank, 60% of the West Bank, which is Area C. And the annexationist intentions are becoming clearer and clearer over time. And when I say annexationist, Israel has a very intensive and growing physical presence in the West Bank through both settlement activity, in terms of numbers of settlers, in terms of the strategic location of settlements in ways that break up Palestinian contiguity, and in terms of Israeli army presence. It doesn't look, in addition to civilian infrastructure, it's very hard to imagine how Israel rolls that back, and it doesn't look like Israel has any intention of rolling it back, given how energetically Israel's expanding that presence. At the same time, you have growing legitimization of annexation within the Israeli rhetorical debate. We have numerous right-wing parties, including the prime minister and the leading Likud party, who openly support various forms of annexation. The prime minister now famously promised to annex all Israeli settlements at some point. And we have legislation or bills that have been proposed in a kind of accelerated pace over the last number of years, advancing various forms of annexation. So it's hard to see how that turns back. And of course, the UN has determined through its investigation, through its commission reports after the last war in Gaza, that Israel does maintain effective control over Gaza, even though it's pulled out the army and settlements from inside Gaza. But Israel controls all the perimeters except for the Rafah border, and controls the electromagnetic sphere and airspace and all crossings other than Rafah and land crossings and population registry. So Israel does have very tight control over the region. And some people think that where's the conflict? Simply Israeli control. However, we have had, in the past, phases of negotiations, and those negotiations have been oriented since 1991 and more substantially since 1993. All negotiations between Israel and Palestinian leadership have been around a two-state solution. The idea is that the two parties can separate themselves into two sovereign and separate entities, both sovereign independent states. That looks increasingly unlikely over the years, and especially in recent years, given what I just said in the beginning, that Israel's annexationist intentions are manifested in its physical presence and its growing legal basis for annexation. It's hard to see how the two sides ever completely separate. The political leadership of Israel over the last 10 years has been a right-wing government that is essentially openly hostile to the idea of a two-state solution, and public support for it on both sides among Israelis and Palestinians is reflective of the reality on the ground and the reality of their leadership. And so we see support declining slowly and incrementally on both sides. I've done surveys with my colleague, my Palestinian colleague, Khalil Shikaki. We do a joint Palestinian and Israeli survey where we found in July of 2018 that both sides dipped below the halfway mark, dipped below 50% in terms of support for a two-state solution. We can still see small ups and downs. One population might go slightly over 50% at any given point. But among Israeli Jews and Palestinians in that particular survey, only 43% supported a two-state solution. So even if the numbers go a little bit up and down, or different polls can show them at slightly different levels, what we're seeing is a real collapse of the general idea that this is the consensus paradigm. But it reflects the reality on the ground.
Well, I mean, the reality on the ground is a product of a series of political choices that played out in the decades since Oslo. So it didn't happen by accident. These were self-reinforcing trends. But my impression is at this point, the overwhelming majority of Jewish Israelis, and certainly of the Jewish Israeli political establishment, no longer has any interest in giving up any of the control that it's managed to win. So whether we're talking about legal changes in the status of parts of the West Bank or other occupied territories, or rights for Palestinians, or any of the questions that come up for those of us who are interested in, some kind of solution to the conflict, it seems like there's no longer a political need for the Israeli establishment to have to give up any of these things that it likes having.
Well, political need is an interesting point because it can go in both directions. Where does political need come from? It comes from the politicians feeling that they need voter support. And if the voters aren't demanding it, and politicians worry that they'll look too left-wing or too weak if they propose it, then you're right, they back out of it.
Or from international pressure, right?
Exactly.
There used to be constraints that made Israel need to at least make noises about negotiations, let's say, and they've now found that they don't even have to pretend to be considering right of return or giving the PA more control or more sovereignty.
So that's exactly the other side of it, right? One side is domestic pressure and the other side is international pressure. And I think that it is in some ways debatable how much pressure Israel ever really faced in the past. I mean, what we've seen is that there's basically been, unrestrained settlement growth pretty much almost since the end of the Six-Day War. And, there's been moments, I would say there's been particular moments when there has been international pressure for Israel to move ahead on negotiations, but they've been the exception rather than the rule. And when they have led to some sort of breakthrough, you can say the Oslo Accords were a breakthrough, even if they were not a peace agreement. They were a breakthrough in the negotiation process. They happened largely because Israel decided to go in that direction, not necessarily because of American pressure. There's been American pressure in the past. There have been, there's lots of talk about international pressure, but in fact, Israel's international situation, as you pointed out, not only hasn't faced significant pressure in the past to restrain itself in terms of its expansionism in the West Bank, but Israel arguably is in a better international position than ever before. I mean, Prime Minister Netanyahu says this all the time as part of his kind of stump speech, but he's essentially right. Israel has great friends in the West, despite the noise of the potential boycott movement. The European Union remains Israel's number one trading partner. Israel's doing, great with America as far as Israel's concerned. And at the same time, Netanyahu has been vigorously going around the world and making lots of other friends among countries that are not the natural partners that you would think of when you think of Israel as part of the family of Western democracies. He's infamously tight with, Viktor Orban in Hungary. He welcomed Duterte from the Philippines, and he's going around Africa and making, friends with Chad and all sorts of countries. Poland, oddly,
so
despite the fact,
this is an axis of authoritarianism.
Maybe you can call it proto-authoritarianism or a spectrum of authoritarianism or illiberalism or illiberal democracies, the whole range of non-liberal democracies. I think that Netanyahu is basically saying anywhere we can have allies around the world to diversify the sources of support is good for Israel. And he's been doing that very assertively and with a lot of success over the years. It also expands Israel's markets, right? Helps develop, cushion Israel financially. So in case there ever is something like a serious economic boycott, which I don't see anytime soon. I don't see any sort of serious economic boycott with any actual ramifications on Israel. But I think that it's part of his policy is, again, to diversify sources of political support, but also to diversify Israel's, international trade and quite successfully, I should say.
Well, I mean, if the international situation is as you describe, and there is not any appreciable political pressure, and the domestic sources of support for a two-state solution are diminishing, what is it that people imagine or support in its place, if anything? I mean, what are the possibilities now in terms of how Israelis and Palestinians imagine this conflict playing out, or what's the end game to all of this?
Well, this is where it gets complicated, and on both sides. I mean, let me just start with the Palestinian side. Despite the fact that we've seen such a decline in support, and Palestinian support is below 50% for a two-state solution, there's no good answer to the question of what do they want instead. It's not that all of a sudden we see 60% of Palestinians supporting one equal democratic state. It's just not the case. It's still about barely in the low 30s level of support for a one-state solution among Palestinians. Among Israelis, a one equal state solution is even lower. It's about 20% if you tell them that all Palestinians are going to be equal citizens and have the right to vote. So it's not like people have a very clear vision of what comes next. And the reasons for that is that among the Israeli right wing, I think they have a vision which involves Israeli annexation, formalizing Israel's permanent control. They haven't totally agreed about the level of Palestinian equality, if at all, or citizenship. And so they don't really want to say it. And so they don't articulate it. And so it's hard to kind of come up with what that vision is, but it clearly involves permanent Israeli control. And Israeli control under a Jewish identified Israel, not some sort of a diversified identity for this country that is going to be de facto under Israel's control. Among the center and the left, it gets a little murky too. They pretty much still support a two-state solution. Okay, and that block together is over 40% of Israelis. Remember, it's not tiny. They still support a two-state solution, but they just don't see how we get there. So that's not like they support something else in its stead. And there aren't that many ideas out there for what the alternatives could be, although I am heavily engaged in some of the efforts to find such alternatives, such as the idea of a two-state confederation, which is kind of two states in terms of both sides having independence and self-determination and sovereignty, but with more cooperation, open borders, a joint economic and security policy, the ability to live as residents on the other side and keep your citizenship on the side of your nationality, which is more of an accurate reflection of where these societies really are. I don't think you can truly separate them anymore. Anyway, it's kind of a creative idea that's being developed and advocated by a range of civil society actors, journalists, policymakers, thinkers, peace activists, NGO people from both Israelis and Palestinians. But it's kind of a new idea, and it's just barely becoming part of the discourse. We've started to test it in polls. It has maybe, around the 25% mark, 30% mark, a little over 30%. But this is just one of, this is just among a small group of people who think that there is a need for a solution. I think one of the other real dangers is that on the Israeli side, many policymakers and people, regular citizens say, maybe we don't really need a solution. The status quo is okay. And it's very hard for them to see that the status quo, they don't see why it's not sustainable. And, for a long time, people like me have been saying it's not sustainable. But it gets very hard to make that argument given that Israel is doing so well in terms of its macroeconomic indicators and its, international engagement. And I think that the main argument for that is it is sustainable, but what kind of society will Israel become? It is already becoming an illiberal society inside the Green Line, and it is clearly illiberal, if not semi-authoritarian, in all the places that Israel controls, where it controls, millions of Palestinians, but does not give them any effective say in their own government.
We'll be right back.
At a time when the focus of politics is on being the loudest voiced and not the most informed, the Century Foundation delivers thoughtful, evidence-based policy leadership with purpose. And we've had a lot of practice at it, 100 years in fact. I'm Michael Wahid Hanna, and I work on U.S. foreign policy and Middle Eastern politics, carrying on a tradition that TCF's founder began in 1919. Our approach is simple. We sweat the details, doing the hard work today to ensure policy progress tomorrow. In the century ahead, we'll continue to prioritize rigor over reactivity, elevate the best ideas and most diverse voices, and never lose sight of what it takes to make an impact. If you want to help write the progressive headlines of tomorrow, support us today.
You're listening to the TCF World Podcast. I'm Thanasi Kambanis. I'm here with Michael Heathana and our guest, Dalia Shandlin, who's in town from Tel Aviv. And we've just been talking about some of the long-term trends in Israeli politics and where the two-state solution or other variants lie today. And now I want to ask Dalia to help us think about America's policy and what the United States government can do differently in terms of promoting this confederation she was just talking about, or any other better approach than the one we've been seeing trotted out over the last couple of years.
You know, over the years, I would say if you take the long view, America has formally been on the side of a two-state solution, but arguably has not really thrown its weight behind that solution in ways that would kind of push Israel harder to get there. And I understand why, right? It's a political, it's just toxic politically to try to pressure Israel in any way that goes outside the constraints of the American debate. I'm not justifying it or not, but that's the reason why America has not been tougher with Israel. The best America has done is to push Israel and support Israel through negotiations and host negotiations, and sometimes try to really commit diplomatic efforts to getting the two sides towards a two-state solution. But there's rarely been any form of pressure to get there. And it seems that that's the only thing that could possibly work in the sense of actually reaching an agreement where Israel would have to make lots of compromises. The U.S. hasn't been willing to do that.
What does pressure look like? I mean, given that Obama tried words.
Right. The pressure was words. The pressure was diplomatic, rhetorical, but it was not, so the kinds of things that actually would have an impact on Israeli policy or finances, right? I mean,
such as?
Well, Obama signed a $38 billion aid package for Israel. And a lot of that, there's a reason why that is something that's hard to just dispense with, right? Because a lot of that money comes to Israel for its defense industry so that Israel can buy American weapons. This is a loop with the America-Israel codependence. I can't say we can just do away with that. However, those are the kinds of things that would have to be on the table. That kind of aid for Israel's military industries, for Israel to be able to say, well, we can't sustain this because we don't have the American faucet. The faucet is being cut off. We simply won't be able to do this anymore in the same way we have before. That's the kind of thing that is pressure that goes beyond words or encouragement, right, to reach a two-state solution. And if America's not willing to do that, then the other thing that America could be, well, let's talk about what America has done. Under the current administration, the president and the ambassador and the chief negotiator, the triumvirate, we should say, have taken this conflict in a completely different direction. They've gotten so far away from anything that treats the two sides as equal partners trying to reach a resolution into essentially ensuring that Israel will always be the dominant party, affirming that in every possible way, from moving the embassy to Jerusalem to recognizing Israel's annexationist tendencies by recognizing Israeli sovereignty in the Golan Heights, which plays into the Palestinian dynamic. Even just to a few weeks ago with the ambassador breaking down the wall of a tunnel that runs underneath East Jerusalem, which is kind of a symbolic recognition of Israel's sovereignty over East Jerusalem as well. All of these things shift the dynamic entirely. They basically tell the Palestinians, you are not an equal partner. Israel is the only serious interlocutor here. We give Israel all the backing to do anything it wants, and that essentially legitimizes trends I talked about before of Israel formalizing its total control over the region in a way that is not going to be a democracy. So one thing America could do is roll itself back from where it is going. I don't see that happening under a Trump administration, but possibly in the future. Reaffirm its commitment to treating both sides as equal independent parties that need to reach a mutually satisfactory resolution to the conflict, whatever it may be. And then I think what America needs to do is probably put, tougher pressure on Israel in terms of actually withholding some of those benefits, if it is to get Israel to make any sort of concessions, and also decide what the end game is. Is it the traditional two-state partition between two independent countries, one of which is a strong, stable, variously democratic and certainly economically, an economic powerhouse, we should say, and the other one, which would be an isolated, mostly landlocked, other than Gaza, but Israel will continue to control Gaza's sea borders, essentially non-viable little entity that probably won't really be able to govern itself properly as a separate independent state, given all the constraints placed on it. Is America going to continue sort of roping itself into this direction of a traditional two-state solution that probably won't ever be implemented or maintained? Or will American policymakers say, we need to change the endpoint of where we're going in order to create a realistic one?
Well, and in terms of policy making, obviously, it takes its cues from politics, and we're beginning to see, I think, some interesting discussions happening in U.S. politics, discussions that that I didn't imagine happening. Do you think that these are that these new trends in American politics will have any kind of impact in future years?
I think they will. I mean, I think Israelis are always attentive to what goes on in America. They're not always as attentive as some people think they are. And it's always been ironic to me that Israelis just take for granted American Jewish support, for example. They don't know the name AIPAC, but they just know that American Jews love them and give them lots of money. And when the American Jewish community was having very heated debates over AIPAC, and then then J Street was created, Israelis never heard of J Street for years until recently, and they didn't follow these debates at all. And by the same logic, they sort of know that America as a country is just on our side. They didn't really ever imagine that different administrations would do anything particularly differently up until now. And I think what we're seeing now is growing awareness inside Israel that the division over how America should treat Israel, not just in the Jewish community, but at the political level among the two parties and among the supporters of those parties, is becoming a really significant distinction and a real wedge issue in American politics. I mean, I have to say, I think that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict plays an outsized role in the American perception of what we care about in terms of foreign policy. And I think that Israelis are more attuned to that than in the past. I saw more coverage of the midterm elections than in the past, and certainly more coverage of, in detailed coverage of who are the young Democratic voters? Why are they so much more critical of Israel than older Democratic voters? Why are Democrats in general so much more critical of Israel than Republicans? And how deep the split is becoming. We see coverage of those polls coming out from Gallup every so often, showing this major partisan divide in America. And they're increasingly also aware of the divide within the Jewish community between younger and older people. And so I think that right now it's still at a theoretical level among the Israeli perception. This is not something the Israelis or political parties are debating as the elections are near. They're not saying, gee, where does each Israeli political party stand on how to deal with changing perceptions in America? But I do think there's a longer term awareness that America might not be a stalwart supporter of every sort of annexationist whim that Israel may have. I shouldn't call it a whim since it's been going on for so long. I think that they might start to realize that it's not something they can depend on depending on who the administration will be.
Well, so here's a question. I mean, I very much welcome this long overdue willingness among some American politicians to talk critically about problematic Israeli policies. Very little, I have very little sense of specific actions, meaningful actions that any, it's toxic enough politically to just be critical, but that turns out not to necessarily mean anything. Is there a way for the U.S. to somehow withdraw any material support for settlements while maintaining its other financial and assistance relationships with Israel?
It's a good question, but I don't know if I don't think there's a real way for America just to stop supporting settlements, because there is no separate administration for settlements. Settlements are supported by every ministry in the Israeli government.
And there's no direct U.S. financial assistance that goes to settlements.
U.S. military assistance goes to the IDF. The IDF is run out of Jerusalem. I mean, this is the Israeli government that runs the army. And so it's not that there's one settlement division of the Israeli army. Managing the West Bank, and certainly in Area C, is one of the biggest operational tasks of the Israeli army right now. So it would have to be specifically cutting defense aid, is what you're saying.
Could the U.S. say, we'll give you this defense aid, but none of it can be spent in the occupied territories?
It's interesting that you asked that, because it's a great parallel to what both Israel and the U.S. are trying to say about the Palestinians, right? Israel's, I don't know if listeners know, but Israel collects taxes on behalf of the Palestinian Authority under the Oslo Accords, essentially. And what Israel's been saying is, since some of that money goes to sustaining the families of people who are security prisoners, some of whom are terrorists, but a lot of whom are just people who had very vague links to some terrorist organization, but maybe not even the actual terrorists in that organization. It's a very controversial issue. Israel's been saying we're going to withhold that money until the Palestinian Authority stops giving money to those families or to those people who are security prisoners. And we'll just withhold exactly that amount from your taxes, which is devastating because it, of course, is the only major source of income for the Palestinian Authority. So what you're saying is essentially, why doesn't America consider treating Israel in the same way? Say you have policies we don't like, just like the Palestinians have policies we don't like, and we will just withhold that amount of money. It sounds like a logical idea. I have a hard time imagining any American administration doing it politically. And I think that the way, certainly under the right-wing governments in Israel, it would be treated as such an incredible betrayal that it's hard to imagine. It would like pandemonium would break out in the Israeli political environment. Now, the only way around that, I would say, is if you have an Israeli government who is of the same orientation that you are, who says, listen, in any case, we have to roll back this enterprise.
But as you said in the first part of this conversation, that does not seem to be in the cards.
It doesn't seem likely.
Long-term political trend.
It doesn't seem likely. However, we should put out there the distinct possibility that a major opposition party could win the elections. It could. And if that happens, for example, take Blue and White, which was tied for the same number of seats in the previous election in April. Blue and White's platform on the conflict is very nondescript. They don't even say the words two-state solution. They talk about kind of a separation, which you can deduce might lead to a two-state solution. They even talk about strengthening settlements in the major settlement blocks. But the flip side of that is that, again, by deduction, you'd have to assume that they intend to roll back the settlements that even most Israelis in the military establishment consider damaging to Israel. So those that are isolated, those that make it hard for Palestinians to have any sort of viable economic and social life, which makes them angrier and makes them more hostile, which are hard to defend and are considered illegal even under Israeli terms. So if one of those, if that opposition party should really win, you can imagine they would at least probably try to roll back the more controversial settlements, or I should say the settlements that are less controversial in Israeli life in terms of limiting their expansion. And so in that case, that would probably be something they would do in coordination with the Americans, and it would be very, very small and incremental. It's hard to imagine a big dramatic change unless we're looking far into the future and a very, very bold new kind of American leadership who's willing to take that kind of action to pressure Israel into going further.
If we get beyond the tactics, then we have to think about what it's for. And the kind of easy answer that took many years and decades to become part of, American political thinking, the two-state solution, increasingly, as you note, looks impossible. What then is an American administration thinking about shifting course? What is an American administration working toward?
Yeah.
What does that political settlement look like?
And can I just build on that question? Could it be a one-state solution, or could it be a dialogue where we just talk about rights and we say it's not our business whether it's one state or two state, but it is our business whether everyone living under your control has the right to vote and other equal rights?
Yeah, I think that's a very important question because, as you pointed out, those what you euphemistically called the changes in American policy, in American discourse around the conflict. What I think we're talking about is specific frontrunners or prominent Democratic figures who are very critical of the occupation, critical of settlements, supporting Palestinian rights and self-determination. But what I don't see them doing is taking it to the next step and saying, we're critical of this because we want to end it. Here's how we propose ending it, or here's what we think would be good for Israel and the Palestinians to end it. And I think that's because there is an awareness that the two-state solution is so stuck. So I want to just back up and say that all of the changing discourse in America is important, but it will be limited until there is an endgame.
It's almost as if it's too late.
It might be
if this was 1995, this talk about the accepted criticism of the settlement enterprise, you can imagine the ways in which that has real appreciable knock-on effects on the policy. It's less clear to me now what that looks like.
Put it this way, I don't think it's ever too late to dismantle an oppressive structure of military government over a civilian population. It's never too late to end what is essentially an oppressive regime. It's never too late for people to become independent when they have not had self-determination for their entire history. It is never too late for that. And it is never too early to start demanding that. So some people say, despite our conversation, there are people on the other side saying, well, these things take time. No, The time is now. Okay, but we do need an endgame, and it has to be a realistic endgame. If the two-state solution is no longer a realistic endgame, the options are limited. It's either one state with unequal rights, unequal levels of citizenship. You can call that whatever you want, but it's not an acceptable situation for a country that wants to be democratic. So either Israel does that and gives up on any pretensions to democracy, or it's one state with full equal rights for all citizens. But on the de facto level, that's going to be very difficult because Palestinians are so alienated. They probably won't. They won't believe. They probably won't believe or want full Israeli citizenship. And how can you just join the citizen body of the country that's been oppressing you all these years? They will probably feel so marginalized that they won't even participate in democratic life if they were offered. There's no doubt in my mind that Israel will create obstacles to them taking citizenship, even if they theoretically offer it, just as it has created such obstacles for East Jerusalem Palestinians. And so even the idea of one equal state, it's very hard for me to see how that is implemented in practice. I can't even see a path to getting to an equal one-state situation. And so it's almost by default that I have come to think that the best approach is to accept that both sides need self-determination, national self-determination. The Palestinians are an identity. They are a people. They are a nation. They need self-determination. They have a territory. They should have a better government. I wish for all Palestinians to have a better government, but they deserve to elect their own. At the same time, I think it is totally unsustainable, impractical. I don't see how there can be an agreement and implementation or sustainability of ethnic segregation between Israeli Jews and Palestinians. And so I think that the idea of two states that are open, cooperative, have certain institutions to share policies, such as mostly security and economic policy, but have their separate parliaments and their separate legislatures, separate executives for managing their own affairs is probably the best and the only one that I can imagine actually being both agreed on, implemented, and sustained.
Seems like equal rights might be a good rhetorical starting point for a better U.S. policy. We're going to have to leave it there for today, but hopefully we'll have you back on the podcast soon. Dalia Shanlin joining us, and I'm Thanasi Kambanis with my colleague Michael Wahid Hanna here in New York at the Century Foundation. You've been listening to the TCF World Podcast. Till next time. TCF World has been brought to you by the Century Foundation, a progressive public policy think tank that seeks to foster opportunity, reduce inequality, and promote security at home and abroad. For more information about our work, please visit tcf.org or follow us on Twitter and Facebook.